Richard never wanted for anything. His father, a titan of industry, had ensured that. Richard had inherited his father's steely resolve, but lacked the ambition that had driven his old man. He craved excitement, adventure, something more than the endless cycle of society galas and board meetings. His friends, accustomed to his extravagant whims, scoffed. They called it a midlife crisis, a futile attempt to find himself in the middle of the ocean. But Richard was determined. He hired a seasoned crew, stocked the yacht with provisions fit for a king, and charted a course for adventure. The open sea awaited. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. Richard, strapped to his bunk for safety, could feel the yacht groaning under the relentless assault. The roar of the wind was deafening, punctuated by the crash of waves against the hull. Each lurch, each creak of the ship sent a jolt of fear through his heart. Then a sound he'd never forget. A sickening crunch, a splintering of wood, a scream lost to the wind. Richard's stomach lurched. He knew with chilling certainty that the yacht had been breached. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of darkness and noise. Richard awoke to the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore. He lay on his back, blinking against the harsh glare of the sun. His head throbbed, his body ached, and his mouth tasted of salt. As his senses returned, the full horror of his situation began to dawn. He was lying on a beach, a pristine stretch of white sand that met a turquoise sea. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, their fronds rustling like whispers. But it was the wreckage that told the true story. Splintered wood, mangled metal, and shredded sails littered the beach, a testament to the storm's fury. With a groan, Richard pushed himself up onto his elbows. His gaze swept the beach, searching for any sign of life, any sign of his crew, but there was nothing. Driven by a primal need to survive, Richard staggered to his feet. The island, though small, was a riot of vegetation. Giant ferns unfurled their emerald wings, their fronds dripping with moisture. Strange, colorful flowers bloomed in profusion, their perfume heavy and sweet. For a brief, fleeting moment, a sense of wonder washed over Richard. He had dreamed of discovering an untouched paradise, a place untouched by the hand of man. He followed a narrow stream that wound its way through the jungle, its water cool and clear. He was alive. The sun beat down on Richard's neck as he pushed his way through the dense undergrowth. The initial euphoria of survival was fading, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. This island, for all its beauty, held an unsettling silence. No animals scurried at his approach, no birds sang in the trees. It was as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. He stumbled upon a clearing, a small patch of sunlight amidst the emerald gloom, and there, etched into the trunk of a towering tree, were markings, not the random scratchings of nature, but deliberate carvings. Crude images of stick figures, animals with too many legs, and strange symbols he couldn't decipher. His heart quickened. He wasn't alone. Someone or something had been here before him. A shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't paradise. It was a prison. His gaze fell to the ground, drawn by a glint of metal. It was a spear fashioned from a sharpened branch, its tip hardened by fire. The jungle, once a source of awe, now pressed in on Richard, a suffocating green labyrinth. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent his heart racing. He was being watched. He could feel it, eyes unseen but ever present, followed his every move. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, the product of fear and exhaustion. But the whispers in the jungle were growing louder, more insistent. Nightfall brought no comfort. Days blurred into a desperate struggle for survival. Richard scavenged for food, his once pampered hands now adept at catching fish with sharpened sticks and gathering edible plants. But the fear was a constant companion, a shadow that stretched longer with each passing hour. He stumbled upon a clearing, drawn by the telltale tendrils of smoke rising into the air. A fire recently extinguished smoldered in the center of a circle of crude huts. But it was the sight that lay beyond the fire that made Richard's blood run cold. Human bones, skulls, ribs, femurs, scattered across the clearing like macabre decorations. Some were old, bleached white by the sun and picked clean by scavengers. Others were fresh, still bearing scraps of flesh and emitting a sickly sweet stench that made Richard's stomach churn. This wasn't just a deserted island. Richard stumbled back from the charnel ground, his mind reeling. He needed answers, a way to rationalize the horror he'd witnessed. Back at the wreckage of his yacht, amidst the scattered belongings that were once symbols of his carefree life, he found a book. It was a forgotten travelogue, tucked away in a pile of novels, its pages filled with tales of far-flung corners of the world. And there, nestled amongst descriptions of exotic flora and fauna, was a chapter that chilled him to the bone. The Sentinelles. The name jumped out at him from the page, a death knell in the eerie silence of the ruined cabin. They were the island's only inhabitants, a tribe untouched by the modern world, fiercely protective of their isolation. The book spoke of their hostility, their refusal to allow outsiders onto their shores. Richard's blood ran cold. The weight of his predicament settled on Richard's shoulders like a physical burden. He was trapped on an island, hunted by a tribe that viewed him as an enemy. The book offered no solutions, only warnings. His mind, honed by years of boardroom battles and financial negotiations, struggled to find a viable strategy. Two options presented themselves, neither appealing. He could flee deeper into the jungle, hoping to evade the Sentinelese and find a way to signal for help. But the jungle was a treacherous maze, and he was already weak from hunger and exhaustion. The chances of survival seemed slim. Driven by a desperate hope, Richard chose to seek contact. He followed the faint sound of drums, the rhythmic beat growing louder with each step. He moved cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest, the spear he'd found clutched tightly in his hand. As he pushed aside a curtain of vines, a sight that would forever be seared into his memory unfolded before him. In a clearing illuminated by the flickering light of a bonfire, a group of Sentinelese men danced. Their bodies, adorned with paint and scars, moved with a primal intensity that sent shivers down Richard's spine. And then he saw it, held aloft in the hands of one of the dancers, illuminated by the firelight, was a human skull. It was a gruesome trophy, a stark reminder of the tribe's brutal customs. Richard's hope, fragile as it was, shattered. He turned and fled, the sound of their chanting echoing behind him. Survival was now his only goal. The jungle floor became a blur of green and brown as Richard ran. Thorns ripped at his clothes, vines snagged at his feet, but he didn't dare slow down. The chilling rhythm of the drums echoed through the trees, a primal beat that spurred him onward. They were close, he could feel it. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for respite, but he pushed himself harder, fueled by a primal fear he had never known. He had tasted freedom, experienced the vastness of the world, and now it was being ripped away from him, inch by agonizing inch. A flash of movement in the corner of his eye. He threw himself to the ground, narrowly avoiding a spear that thudded into the trunk of a tree beside him. This was a hunt, and he was the prey. Richard scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had to put distance between himself and the hunters. His pursuers were gaining on him. Richard could hear their guttural shouts getting closer. Desperation lent him a burst of energy, and he scrambled up a rocky slope, his lungs burning, his vision blurring at the edges. He emerged onto a small, rocky outcrop, the waves crashing against the rocks far below. The wind whipped at his face, carrying the salty tang of the ocean and the distant chilling sound of the Sentinelese closing in. There was nowhere left to run. He sank down onto the rough rock, his back against a weathered boulder. His hand instinctively went to the gash on his arm, the wound throbbing in time with his racing heart. He was a prisoner, trapped between the unforgiving jungle and the endless sea. He couldn't give up. Not now. Richard knew that if he surrendered to despair, it would be the end. He had to try, even if the odds were stacked against him. There had to be something, some way to signal for help. He raced back to the wreckage of his yacht, tearing through the debris with a renewed sense of urgency. His eyes scanned the mangled remains of his once luxurious vessel, searching for anything that could be salvaged. And then he saw it, a glint of metal half buried in the sand. The emergency flare gun, standard issue on all seafaring vessels. It was battered, but miraculously intact. His heart surged with a desperate hope. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. He aimed the flare gun towards the heavens and pulled the trigger. The flare arced through the sky, a fiery red streak against the azure expanse. For a fleeting moment, it illuminated the island, casting long, distorted shadows across the beach and the jungle's edge. Richard watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as the flare reached its zenith and began its slow descent towards the sea. His gaze remained fixed on the distant speck of the plane, willing it to see, to understand the desperate plea of a lone man, stranded at the edge of the world. But the plane continued on its course, unwavering, a silver bird disappearing into the vastness of the sky. Richard crumpled to his knees, the flare gun slipping from his grasp to land with a dull thud on the sand. The silence that descended was heavier than the silence of the jungle, deeper than the silence of the sea. It was the silence of utter despair, of hope extinguished. He was trapped. The island, once a fleeting dream of paradise, had become his inescapable prison. Richard The wealthy adventurer was now at the mercy of forces far greater than himself.